We'd like to welcome you to the Ethics CE training webinar. My name is Joanna Truitt, Manager for Continuing Education and Experience, and I will serve as your host today. Facilitating this training is Leo Rajeski, CFP Board General Counsel. We anticipate that this webinar will be about 90 minutes. In preparation for this training, we do hope that you've had a chance to access the documents for the new Ethics CE presentation, as well as review the new code and standards. Before we get started, we do have one housekeeping note. If you do have a question you'd like to ask, please type it into the Q&A text box on the right-hand side of the screen. We will ensure plenty of time for your questions after the content for each learning objective has been covered, as well as at the end of the presentation. This training will provide a comprehensive review of the new code and standards as it will be presented. As mentioned earlier, we will address questions after the content for each learning objective has been reviewed. So let's begin. Learning Objective 1, the structure, content, and significant changes to the code and standards.
So Joanna, thank you. And as I'm looking at the list of participants, I see some friends are online. So Kurt, Jeff, Dennis, and Steve, I'm glad that you're going to be with us for this presentation. And I'm sure that you'll be getting back in touch with me personally if there's something we don't cover. So the revised code and standards have a number of significant changes to the content. There's a new structure and organization, and in particular, the duties to clients, firms, and subordinates in the CFP board are really important sections of the standard. We're going to cover each of these. So the most significant changes to the content are the expanded application of the fiduciary duty, the updated duties to clients, a revised definition of financial planning. There's been some changes to the practice standards that we believe make them more modern. There's also a new process for bankruptcy, and there are new enhanced requirements for reporting. You'll note that in your slide deck, within each slide, there are comments, and we've provided for you a bit of a description for each of these categories that will enable you, when you're presenting this course, to be able to let the individuals who are enrolled understand a little bit more about each of these points. So, for example, the expanded application of the fiduciary duty. CFP professionals previously were required to act as a fiduciary when providing financial planning or material elements of financial planning. In the revised code and standards, a CFP professional is required to act as a fiduciary at all times when providing financial advice to a client. Financial advice is broadly defined, which means that the application of the fiduciary duty has been expanded significantly. So each one of these changes, again, are discussed in greater detail in the comments, and I encourage you to read those. Let's talk a little bit about the structure. So the structure has changed. The most significant element of this is that 4 documents have been consolidated into one. This organization just makes the code and standards more accessible. The code and standards that's been revised retains a lot of the same information, yet it's shorter in length, which makes it more user-friendly for those who are trying to access the information. As you can see with this chart, the current standards and the revised standards. On the revised side, we have a brief descriptive preamble that captures the purpose and effect of the code and standards, and then a code of ethics, which delineates general principles that guide the behavior of CFP professionals. That follows, and then the standards of conduct provide greater elaboration for everything that's in the code of ethics. The Code of Ethics has 6 elements to it. It's principles-based. It always applies. So, for example, if you take a look at the first item on the list, act with honesty, integrity, competence, and diligence, those are always required. And the last item says that you have to act in a manner that positively reflects on the financial planning profession and CFP certification. Again, each of these items is addressed more specifically in the duties to client section of the standards of conduct. The standards of conduct themselves have 6 sections. So we have the duties owed to clients, financial planning and the application of the practice standards themselves, a topic we call circumvention that basically says you can't do something indirectly what you're prohibited from doing directly. Then we also have the duties owed to firms and subordinates, and then duties owed to CFP board. So we put at the very first what we consider to be the most important thing. It's the duty that you have to clients. Each one of these sections deals with a different subject, and so we'll address them in turn. The duties owed to clients has a number of provisions that existed in the current standards, but that have been revised and updated here. So the first 3 are integrity, competence, and diligence. The slide deck we provided for you gives a short description of what each of these means. You know, integrity is honesty and candor that is not subordinated to personal gain or advantage. And the standard also contains the anti-fraud language that you would find in the federal law as well as under state law. Competence has been revised somewhat. This says that a CFP professional must provide the services with competence, which means with relevant knowledge and skill to apply that knowledge. And the standard addresses what a CFP professional is to do when they're not sufficiently competent in a particular area to provide the professional services. Basically, the CFP professional must gain the competence, obtain the assistance of a competent professional, limit or terminate the engagement, and or refer the client to a competent professional. So we also have standards for objectivity, professionalism, and communications. So this is sound and objective professional judgment, which means that when you're exercising professional judgment, a CFP professional must act objectively to serve the interest of the clients rather than themselves, their firms, or anyone else. This is also the standard that talks about solicitation or acceptance of gifts. And the standard says you can't do that if it could reasonably be expected to compromise a CFP professional's objectivity. We considered at great length whether to have a principles-based standard like this or to set specific dollar amount limits, and ultimately determined to have a principles-based standard here. In fact, this was one of the discussions that occurred throughout the drafting of this document, when to have a specific rule and when to have a general principle. And each standard was examined with that lens in mind to consider which way would be the most appropriate way for CFP board to address an issue. And in this circumstance, it was the principles-based approach that resonated with most. Professionalism should be fairly straightforward. This is one that applies to everyone, not just clients, but prospective clients, fellow professionals, and others. It's sort of the good conduct standard. Client communications, this is standard A11. You have to provide a client with accurate information in a manner and format that the client could reasonably be expected to understand. So you do that in accordance with the terms of the engagement, as well as in response to reasonable client requests. And again, each of these, I believe you'll find it very helpful to print out this document and go through and read the comments, because if it's unclear to you from the PowerPoint what each of these standards covers, what we've attempted to do to better enable you to make your presentation is to provide that content in the notes so that you'll be able to read it ahead of time, and then even potentially during your presentation, you would have that with you in case a question arose about the specific requirements of the standard. The last one in this grouping, by the way, to comply with the law, that's a pretty important standard. So CFP board is a professional organization, and everybody who is certified at CFP board already has the requirement to comply with the law. And in fact, when we set our standards, one thing we're always wondering is, to what extent should the professional standard, should the standard that CFP board sets, be higher than what the law requires? If all we had was a set of standards that said comply with the law, you could begin and end our standards with just these 4 words. But CFP Board does in fact have standards that are in some circumstances higher than the law requires, but a CFP professional nevertheless is required to comply with the law, and this is the standard, which is A8 in the Code and Standards that sets that forth that information. Confidentiality, privacy, and technology. So confidentiality and privacy are very important. They're mentioned both here in its own standard, section A9, but also at the beginning in the Code of Ethics. So we have a standard that requires a CFP professional to keep confidential and protect the security of personal and non-public information about clients. So we discuss, when a CFP professional may disclose that information, and we've categorized that in 2 different ways. One is for ordinary business purposes, and another is for legal and enforcement purposes. We have a safe harbor for when a CFP professional's firm is subject to, and the CFP professional complies with, Reg SP or an equivalent federal or state law or rule. The technology standard is a new standard. So our current standards do not have this. We believed it was important to add it. Technology is becoming even more important in the delivery of financial planning and other financial services. And so, but technology is also something that is changing very rapidly. So CFP Board recognized this by imposing a principles-based duty that recognizes the importance of technology, but also provides a flexible standard that can adjust with the passage of time. The duty is to use reasonable care when selecting, using, and recommending tech, and it puts forth requirements for each element of those. We have and have had in the past a standard for borrowing, lending, and commingling. So the commingling one is the easy one. You can't do it. It's prohibited. Borrowing and lending is pretty close to that. It's very limited circumstances when somebody may borrow or lend. A CFP professional may borrow or lend with a client. And it's a question, is it a family member, or if the client's a lender that's in the business of lending money. But those are very narrow circumstances where the borrowing and lending with a client is allowed. Representation of compensation method. This is something that's been an issue in the profession for decades. Those of you who've been involved in the profession for that long know this history well. At CFP Board, our focus is on accuracy. We're interested in CFP professionals making accurate representations of compensation method. So the new definition of fee only is consistent with our longstanding interpretation. We define fee only by exclusion, and we address whose compensation we'll be looking at in conducting that evaluation. So it's relatively straightforward, but there are a lot of terms that get defined, and those definitions are important. So you can describe your compensation as fee only when the CFP professional and the CFP professional's firm receive no sales-related compensation in connection with professional services they're providing to clients. So that sales-related compensation, it's on your screen because it's a new term. Most people commonly use the term commissions, but we use the term sales-related compensation because there are some fees that present an incentive for the purchase or sale of particular financial assets, such as a 12B1 fee. And so it's not only commissions that fall in this category. So I guess technically you could say, well, someone who is fee only accept fees. There are some fees that a fee only planner may not accept. Note that the definition of sales-related compensation also includes referral compensation. And there are several examples in the standards of what constitutes sales-related compensation. And there are a number of things, 5 things more specifically, that are explicitly excluded. The other category here is compensation to related parties. That also is considered, and this here is a bit of a change, this compensation to related parties. So it used to be that all compensation to related parties was considered. In the revised Code and Standards, we drew a limit on when the related party compensation would be counted. And that line is, when the compensation is received in connection with any professional services the CFP professional or the CFP professional's firm provides to clients. So in other words, if you establish a firewall between your firm and another firm that's a related party, and your firm is effectively not referring work there and they're not referring it back, then you have the opportunity to continue to say that you and your firm are fee only. The classic example of this is an RIA roll-up firm, where a particular firm may acquire a lot of smaller RIA firms, and down along, the sisters and brothers of companies along the way, there's one company that has commissions. If the RIA is not referring work back and forth from that commission earning related party, then it's not going to be counted here. Another big change is the standard for fee-based. So fee-based to CFP board means commission and fee. If a CFP professional represents the compensation method as fee-based, they may not suggest that the CFP professional or the firm is fee-only, and they also must clearly state either that the professional earns both fees and commissions or is not fee-only. So there's several requirements there. I suspect that likely will come up during your presentations. I encourage you to read the notes here to make sure you understand how that would work. Finally, the representations by a firm. This basically says that you control the firm. When the firm is speaking using these terms, the firm needs to do it in accordance with our standards. And if you don't control the firm and the firm is speaking inaccurately in accordance with our standards, then the CFP professional has to correct any misrepresentation that's made by accurately representing their compensation method to the client. All right, let's move away from well, I guess here's the application. This chart shows it to you, right? Let's walk through this, but if you work your way through, fee only, what's the first question? Are you earning sales-related compensation? If the answer is yes, you're done. You can't do it. What about your firm? If the answer is yes, then again, you can't say fee only. Then you look at related parties. Are they earning it? That's the first part of that question. If the answer is yes, take a look at, is that related party compensation in connection with services that the CFP professional or the CFP professional's firm is providing. So that's a flow chart that helps walk through the fee-only application. All right, now we can move beyond compensation to another new standard. This is working with additional persons. This is something that arises quite a bit. This is when the CFP professional is not the only person who is delivering services to a client. This could be a tax professional. It could be any number of areas where you might have another provider providing services. It could be an estates lawyer. Those are probably the two biggest examples, but there could be others, and there are others. So this is a requirement. What a CFP professional has to do when they're recommending, engaging, and working with additional persons. When recommending or engaging, you have to have a basis for the recommendation based upon the other professional's reputation, experience, and qualifications. And also you have to disclose compensation arrangements. Are you receiving any referral fee, for example, by bringing this person into the relationship? For engagements, take reasonable steps to protect the client's interests. So that's when you're the one doing the engaging, you're hiring the person. For example, if you have confidential information, when you're engaging somebody else to provide services and they're going to get access to that information, your agreement with that person, if you're the one doing the engaging, has to make clear that they also are required to protect that confidential information. And then finally, when working with additional persons, you have to communicate with the other person about who's doing what and what services each are providing, your respective responsibilities. And then, this is an important one, if you're working with somebody else and the other professional is not performing the services in accordance with the scope of the services to be provided and the allocation of responsibilities, there's now a duty to inform the client that's happening. So again, this whole working with additional persons is an entirely new standard. It was added because CFP board believed that this is an important function, an important standard that was necessary to protect the consumer, to protect the client by making sure that those working relationships with additional persons are lined up in a way that's going to help provide effective advice to a client. All right, that's a lot already talking about duties to clients. We've left out some things. Those are things we're going to cover under some of the other learning objectives today. But let's walk now through the duties owed to firms and subordinates. So a CFP professional continues to have duties to firms and subordinates. So for example, the supervision standard, it continues to require reasonable care when supervising with a view towards preventing violations. The supervision is not limited to employees. It could include other persons over whom the CFP professional has responsibility. Who could that be? Well, it could be vendors. It could be people to whom you have subcontracted work. Those are some examples of when that might arise. You're required to comply with the firm's policies and procedures. This is a standard we've had for a long time. If your firm tells you to do something that would violate CFP board standards, you won't be violating our standards if you refuse to do it. That's pretty straightforward. There's also been a modest expansion of the requirement to notify the firm about CFP board discipline. Historically, it had been to notify the firm of suspensions and revocations. This has been expanded slightly to require notification to the firm about any public letter of admonition. So this is about any public discipline. Duties owed to CFP board. So this is an important new standard. Well, not new, we've had it, but it's much more detailed than it had been before. So we have 6 subsections here. We have a definition of terms at the beginning, and then we have a standard that requires a CFP professional to refrain from engaging in conduct that reflects adversely on his or her integrity or fitness as a CFP professional, upon the marks, or upon the profession. So that language has been in place for a long time. We now have a list of conduct that falls within that category that we've taken from cases that CFP Board's Disciplinary and Ethics Commission has decided over a long time. What are some of these things? Well, it includes criminal convictions, a finding in a regulatory or a civil action, a bankruptcy, tax lien, judgment lien, unsatisfied civil judgments. These are all things that reflect adversely. We know about these, so for transparency, we included them in the standards so that everybody would know that if this happens, it's conduct that's problematic with respect to your certification. The reporting requirement, you have 30 days to report a variety of things. The things I mentioned earlier as well as others, there's a long list of what has to be reported in 30 days. And then a narrative statement, so this is necessary so the CFP board understands what the CFP professional's position on the issue is. So a CFP professional has to provide that information as well as cooperate with CFP board during the investigation process. And I guess it should be obvious that since we have the terms and conditions of certification and license, that's the contract the CFP board has with each CFP professional, compliance with that agreement is important. So I also mentioned bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is a big change. Prior to 2012 at CFP board, all bankruptcies were adjudicated as a matter of discipline. In 2012, we changed that, so it didn't go through the disciplinary process if somebody filed for bankruptcy, but it would be an automatic press release. Although it's not discipline, the effect is similar to a public censure. So we've now restored the prior framework by having our Disciplinary and Ethics Commission review bankruptcy matters on a case-by-case basis. What this does is it gives a CFP professional an opportunity to prove that a bankruptcy does not demonstrate that the CFP professional is unable to manage his or her financial affairs. We expect it to be a narrow circumstance when somebody can make that showing, but you might imagine somebody has a child who has a serious medical illness that reasonable insurance coverage couldn't cover, and they have to declare bankruptcy because of that tragedy. That's the sort of thing, if that were to happen, somebody could come to the deck and explain that situation, and the deck may decide not to sanction the person as a disciplinary matter in that circumstance. And that now is an opportunity available to CFP professionals under the revised code and standards. All right. So, Joanna, I guess we have a quick review here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. As we've gone through Learning Objective 1 and all of the content that Leo's covered so far, do any of you have any questions related to what we've reviewed? I'm not seeing any questions, Leo, so I think we can move on to the next learning objective. But just as a reminder, at the end of each learning objective, we're asking you for these live courses, we'd love to have them interactive. And in doing so, what we've done is put together a series of polling questions where you can use Kahoot, which is a free online service that CFP Board has an account with. And again, we've provided all those instructions in the instructor packet. And also as well, we had a number of vignettes pulled together. These vignettes are relatively short, but they are very specific to the information that is covered under this learning objective. So we're asking you to pick one of these four. And however you choose to present the vignette, again, the idea here is to get the audience involved and get them thinking about what we've just talked about and what we just reviewed. So let's move on now to learning objective number 2. Learning objective number 2 is act in accordance with CFP Board's fiduciary duty.
Okay, so this fiduciary duty is clearly the most significant change to CFP Board's Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct. This was a watershed moment in CFP Board's history to go this route. CFP Board had said that the fiduciary duty applies whenever providing financial planning. When CFP Board did that in 2008, it was a big event. It was a big change. That was before, a lot of things that are in place right now. So that was before Dodd-Frank. It was before the DOL rule, before a lot of the recent events. CFP Board went first on fiduciary for financial planning. Well, with the revised Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct, CFP Board concluded that it would be appropriate to require all CFP professionals to agree to act as a fiduciary at all times when providing financial advice. And so our fiduciary duty requires a CFP professional to act in the best interest of the client. This includes a duty of loyalty, a duty of care, a duty to follow client instructions. Financial advice is defined very broadly. Let's take a look at this a little more closely. Acting in the client's best interest as a fiduciary, again, begins with the duty of loyalty. So the duty of loyalty is necessary because the client lacks the knowledge that a CFP professional has. The fiduciary must act to benefit the client and, as opposed to acting to benefit himself or herself. And so there's a number of elements here. First is placing the client's interest ahead of your own. With conflicts, either you avoid them entirely, or, and this is a choice, or you fully disclose the conflict, obtain the client's consent, and then properly manage that conflict. This is an important standard that we'll be talking about a little bit more during our presentation, but it's an aspect of the duty of loyalty. Also, a CFP professional is required to act without regard to the interests of others. This is the third element of the duty of loyalty. And what that means to CFP Board is that when you have a conflict of interest, you're required to act under that conflict in the client's favor and the client's interest. The duty of care requires the CFP professional to act with care, skill, prudence, and diligence of a prudent professional. This takes into account the client's goals, risk tolerances, objectives, and circumstances. The duty of care is a very important standard. It's the care of a professional that must be provided. Duty to follow client instructions, often referred to as the duty of obedience. We didn't put obedience in here. We thought a friendlier term might be more appropriate. But this recognizes that a CFP professional is an agent of a client. That's a pretty critical element of agency law. And as the agent, the CFP professional is required to carry out the terms of the engagement as well as all reasonable and lawful client requests. We've been asked before, well, what if you do if the CFP professional doesn't believe that what the client wants to do is in the client's best interest? I suspect one or more of you have had that situation arise before. Well, under CFP board's standards, what the professional must do is advise the client that you believe that what they want to do is not in their best interest. Ultimately, the client gets to decide what to do. They get to control the relationship. And ultimately, I guess, if you as a CFP professional decide you don't want to work with a client who's not following your advice and is not doing what you consider to be in their best interest, your out is by acting appropriately to terminate the engagement. And so those are the choices available to the CFP professional. Okay, this applies to all financial advice. This is more expansive than when providing financial planning. It applies to clients. So who is a client? It's a person, including a natural person, business organization, or legal entity, to whom the CFP professional provides or agrees to provide professional services pursuant to an engagement. Each one of these terms, you can see engagement, professional services, client, they're all in quotes. They're all defined in the code and standards. You may want to take a look at the code and standards and have it available, of course, with you doing your presentation, but read it ahead of time to become more familiar with how CFP Board has defined those terms. And I mentioned that financial advice has been broadly defined. Here we've laid it out for you. So this includes financial plans, you know that. It also includes recommendations to invest in, purchase, hold, or sell financial assets, recommendations concerning investment strategies or portfolio composition or asset management. If you're selecting and retaining another professional to provide financial or professional services, if you're making a recommendation about that, well, then you've provided financial advice. Now, of course, all these things are communications in that category A. They're communications about these things. Category B really picks up an example of where you're doing the same thing, but there's no communication. And that's where you have discretionary authority over the financial assets. The client said, you know, you have the authority to exercise discretion, and because you're doing that, you are providing financial advice. That's laid out here in the definition of financial advice. So, again, this is a broad definition. It's going to pick up most activities of a CFP professional, and whenever you're doing one of these things, you're required under CFP board standards to act as a fiduciary. So a quick review: duty of loyalty, duty of care, duty to follow client instruction. This duty applies to all financial advice, and financial advice is broadly defined.
Great. Kurt had given us so far so good, pretty straightforward. Did anyone have any questions on the content that we've covered for Learning Objective 2? You'll probably notice as well that we've put together a template. And again, the idea is to organize the information by learning objective, by section. So it always finishes with a quick review of the content that was just covered. And then again, you'll follow up. As it relates again to the polling questions, you can insert those at any point within the content, but definitely make sure that you're selecting one of the vignettes. For Learning Objective 2, we've pulled together 2 different options for you to select from. Select one and move forward. Learning Objective 3, applying the practice standards when providing financial planning.
Thanks, Joanna. One point in follow-up to what you were just mentioning, I might have mentioned a bit earlier as well about the vignettes that we're using here. We provided a number of vignettes for you, as you know, because you're so experienced in presenting these materials to CFP professionals. You know that having vignettes helps. It helps to break up the PowerPoint. It gets the audience participating. It allows you to move forward in a way that becomes less monotonous. We provided the vignettes for you to use. I think one of the challenges you might have is trying to figure out how will the timing work. You have so much time to present the material. There's a lot in here. My recommendation is that you do a trial run. You run through it once to kind of see how long this is going to take you to present it. And then think, having done that, how many of the vignettes you could work your way in. The vignettes are helpful. People typically like having those vignettes If we were going to have more vignettes or a case study, we probably would have had to make this 3 hours instead of 2, but you know that having people in the seats longer than 2 hours becomes a real challenge. But they do help, so please take a look at those, be ready to go through those vignettes with the audience and inject them in the presentation, because it'll help keep everybody in the seats and awake the entire time.
And I just wanted to interject as well that we also provide for you a timed agenda. So again, this gives you a pretty good idea as to the flow of the presentation. It should take you to that full 2 hours, including the vignettes and the polling questions. So we're in good shape there.
So the practice standards have been updated. Well, why are we updating the practice standards? What are we trying to solve here? What's the problem we've encountered? Well, I think one of them is that we believe that the practice standards could be slightly better organized. Before I talk about these changes, though, I want to mention that the people who created the original practice standards were absolutely visionary in thinking through financial planning. They did this back in the late 90s, very early 2000s, when they created out of whole cloth the practice standards for the financial planning process. They thought first of a need to create the document, and then they worked very diligently to establish these standards. They've withstood the test of time. The changes we made, while important and valuable, they can't ignore the fact that the existing standards were so phenomenally valuable to the advancement of the profession. And so when you think through the changes made, there's additional detail in the standards, so there's more requirements. The additional detail and requirements, we believe, just capture what was originally intended for the most part, provides the detail that somebody new to the profession will be able to read and follow and understand how this would work. Again, there are some changes to the process that come into play, but the practice standards themselves, we have a new definition of financial planning, which is very significant, a revised standard for determining whether the practice standards apply. What do you do when, as a CFP professional, you're required to comply with the practice standards, but the client does not want financial planning? I suspect, once again, that many of you have experienced that situation. When we went on the road for public forums and drafting these standards, we went to 17 forums, cities all over the country, and we heard about this circumstance from many CFP professionals who said, this is really important, we'd like for you to address this in the standards, and we did that. There's a documentation requirement when you're providing financial planning. Documentation, by the way, is the internal note-taking that you would make. It's not the delivery to the client. And again, updated in the steps in the financial planning process. You may have heard we've gone from 6 steps to 7 steps. So let's talk about the definition. This is something we addressed a lot in public forums. You probably will get some questions when you deliver the content. The goal here was to shorten the definition, make it clear. We realize that when CFP Board speaks about the definition of financial planning, we're going to be saying it in a way that a standard setter would do it. An individual speaking to a client might word it slightly differently, but this enables a CFP professional to do that by looking at our definition, which is, financial planning is a collaborative process that helps maximize a client's potential for meeting life goals through financial advice that integrates relevant elements of the client's personal and financial circumstances. In the notes to this, we went through for each clause, we walked through why those words were selected. Overall, it's 30 words. Each one, we spent a lot of time thinking about how it should read. We were very deliberate in using this language. I hope you like it, and I hope that you're able to review it in advance of your presentation to be able to talk through why we used those words. The practice standards, so the application of the practice standards, this basically is the standard, when you have to provide financial planning, right? The practice standards apply to financial planning. So when do the practice standards apply? The obvious one is when you've agreed to provide or you actually provide financial planning. The second one is saying the same thing, except instead of using the words financial planning, we use the definition of it. So it's if you've provided or agreed to provide financial advice that requires integration of relevant elements to act in a client's best interest, well, then you are required to comply with the practice standards. And the last requirement is a requirement, it's what the client believes. So under the existing standards, the client's understanding and intent in engaging the CFP professional is a factor that you would use in determining whether the practice standards apply. We've now changed it. It's not the client's understanding and intent by itself, because what if the client is unreasonable? Then why would you want to consider that? So we have made it what a reasonable client would believe, but we also made it independently a way in which the practice standards might apply. If the client had a reasonable basis to believe the CFP professional was providing or had provided financial planning, then the practice standards apply. You don't go to any other factors. That's it. So one of the main categories here is this integration requirement. This is, when do you have to integrate the client's relevant elements to act in their best interest? It's a 5-factor test. This is drawn from the existing standard. We believe that we wrote it in a more comprehensive way, a way that fleshes out the factors in greater detail. One of the factors that had been in place before has been the comprehensiveness of the CFP professional's data gathering. You won't see that in this list because this list is client-centric. It examines the relevant elements of the client's circumstances rather than the kinds of services that a CFP professional is providing. So viewed in that way, this 5-factor list, then tries to take into account what is the effect on the client. Is this something that should require financial planning? It's the number of elements in place, the portion amount of the assets affected, how long are you locking up the client with what you're doing? What about risk? Is the exposure to risk jumping through the roof here? And also, can you undo it? What are the barriers to modification? These are, the factors that come into play in determining whether the practice standards are going to apply. We also have a standard that deals with the CFP board evaluation. So this comes up only in the enforcement context. This is when CFP board has alleged that a CFP professional was required to provide financial planning. In that circumstance, the CFP professional is required to demonstrate that they weren't required to comply with the practice standards. It's basically an evidentiary presumption that arises only in the enforcement context. What we've advised people is that since it's your burden to show that financial planning was not required, you should consider documenting or maintaining evidence of why you decided to do things. That might be helpful for you, but that's what the evaluation standard requires here. We mentioned earlier clients who do not want financial planning. So if you have to provide financial planning and a client doesn't agree to it, here are the choices. This is a new standard. This helps let a CFP professional know what the options are available to them. In the notes to this, we put together an illustration that we thought we might want to use. You might want to use to help illustrate how this would happen. So for example, if you have a client who seeks financial advice on topics 1, 2, and 3, and if you were to provide all 3 of those, financial advice, that would require financial planning. The client doesn't want to engage you to do financial planning. Well, you could say, all right, we're not going to enter the engagement. That's the easiest one. But you could limit the scope of the engagement to financial advice on topic 1, if that would not require financial planning. You can tell the client, I'm only going to be providing advice on topic 1, not 2 and 3. You can do that. Another one is you could tell the client how financial planning would benefit the client, and 2 parts, and how the decision not to engage the CFP professional to provide financial planning may limit the financial advice you're providing. If you've done that, the client still doesn't want financial planning, then you can move forward. You can provide the financial advice on topics 1, 2, and 3 without being required to comply with the practice standards. And the last one, the terminating the engagement, that's just the flip side to not entering into it. If you have an engagement, they can then a CFP professional can terminate it to achieve the same end result. The documentation requirement, we did not put in the practice standards a long list of things that had to be documented. It would have been very long, very cumbersome, and as you know, you're providing a lot of advice to a lot of different people all day long. To have to document every single piece of it at times could become burdensome. So CFP Board came up with a principles-based standard to address the documentation requirement. You have to act prudently in doing it, taking into account the significance of the information. So, for example, if if this is something that has a huge amount of significance to the individual, let's say there's an event that's going to happen in 6 months, and if they don't meet that event, there's a huge cost to that person. Well, then you need to put that in writing. That'd be significant information. The need to preserve the information in writing. Again, what happens if you're not going to be around and that event's going to happen in 6 months? What if you're out of the picture for some reason? Of course, we don't want to assume that, but if that were to happen, how long would it take a CFP professional to figure out that, this needs to be handled right away? So if you need to preserve that information in writing so everybody is aware of what must be done. And then also the obligation to act in the client's best interests. That's a very principles-based standard to be taken into account. And then finally, we recognize that CFP professionals, firms, they have policies and procedures that come into play here in documentation. There are some things that firms may have in place to require or prevent CFP professionals from documenting. That's certainly relevant to what would be required here. So let's work through the practice standards. The practice standards have some changes to them. You can see on the left the current practice standards, the right are the new ones. On this, as well as on everything else, if you haven't done so, I highly encourage you to read the commentary document that CFP Board put out when it issued the revised code and standards. I think just about everything I'm walking through today is probably covered in that document in whole or in a material part. And reading it, I think, would really help you understand what CFP Board did, put it in context, would help you understand exactly what the new standards require. This is a useful one for this, the financial planning process. We went through in the commentary in some pretty good detail what the changes are, why they were made, again, going from 6 steps to 7 steps. The first one, by the way, the establishing and defining the relationship, that was moved to an entirely separate area of our standards. So that had been, the first step in the financial planning process. And now that's no longer there. It's now in the standard called A10. It's defining the relationship. And so we really, in that sense, went from 5 to 7 in making these changes. So I'd say there are a number of reasons for these changes. I mentioned that first one. We just believe that establishing the relationship is something that should come before the practice standards, that the practice standards should address the delivery of services, not the creation of the relationship to provide them. That, again, was a value judgment that was made. But the revised practice standards also require a CFP professional to mutually define the client's goals only after obtaining the information and assessing the client's personal financial circumstances, and not before, as the original practice standards required. This revised ordering also recognizes that a CFP professional needs to understand the client's circumstances to collaborate effectively with the client, to identify and then select goals. We separated developing the recommendations from presenting the recommendations, and those are distinct steps now to more clearly reflect their differences and the importance to each to the financial planning process. One thing you should know as well is that in here, when you look at information that a CFP professional may gather, we actually put together lists of information that become very helpful. So if you look at steps 1 through 3, understanding the client's personal and financial circumstances, obtaining qualitative and quantitative information, we put together a non-exclusive list of that information that we believe would be very helpful for CFP professionals. It could be used as a checklist, for example. Here are the things that you should be thinking about obtaining from the client. And then you move from there to analyzing the information. And if you don't have everything you need, addressing that incomplete information, because, once again, it's only by understanding or knowing the client's situation that a CFP professional may collaborate with the client to develop goals. So this is a very important step in the process to understand what the circumstances are. And so step two, once you've understood the circumstance, if you think you have the information, the first thing you do is talk with the client and give them your assessment of their circumstances. You may learn at that time that you don't really understand their circumstances, and the way you find out is by having that conversation. That's important beginning to selecting goals, is making sure you both are on the same page with what their circumstances are, and armed with that assessment, you work together to develop the goals. What we've envisioned is that a CFP professional will discuss scenarios or potential goals with the client, showing the client how the different decisions will affect the likelihood of desired outcomes. You might illustrate scenarios in real time using software. A lot of CFP professionals are doing this now. This collaboration is going to lead clients to select more realistic goals, become more engaged in the financial planning process, you'll show the client the interrelationship of the client's goals as you're going through this. So the next step is step 3. That's analyzing the current and potential alternative courses of action. So the first thing to do is look at what is the current course of action. Is the current course of action going to get you there? Is that what you need? Do you need more? It may be that the current course works and you don't need to make any changes. But where appropriate, you analyze one or more potential alternative recommendations, analyzing the advantages and disadvantages of the recommendation, whether the recommendation helps maximize the potential for meeting goals, and how the recommendation integrates the relevant elements of the client's circumstances. This is what you do when you're conducting that analysis. So from there, you move on, and you're looking at developing and presenting the recommendation. So the CFP professional develops the recommendation by selecting amongst different courses of action, one or more recommendations designed to do all this, designed to maximize the potential for meeting the client's goals. So in doing this, what do you have to consider? There's a number of things the CFP professional has to consider: the assumptions and estimates, the basis for making the recommendation, including the factors that are set forth in the standard, which are listed in the standard. You need to look at the timing and priority of the recommendation. Is the recommendation independent? Must it be implemented with one or more other recommendations? These are all part of step 4. The rationale for the recommendation needs to provide substantial detail on what you must consider for the recommendation. So how is the recommendation designed to maximize the potential to meet the client's goals? What are the anticipated material effects of the recommendation on the client's circumstances? And how does the recommendation integrate the relevant elements of the client's personal and financial circumstances? So again, this requires the professional to look at how the recommendation takes into account other aspects of the client's life. So, so from there, you go to step 5. That's the presentation. Again, this is now a separate step. It requires the professional to present the recommendation and the information that was required to be considered when developing it. It does not always require a written plan. The standards do not say that. The CFP professional needs to exercise professional judgment in determining how to best present the recommendation to clients. It is notable, though, that presenting the recommendation is its own step. What this reflects is that developing and presenting are distinct actions. There are times where, the CFP professional, first of all, is going to select the recommendation typically prior to meeting and making a presentation to the client. So that involves analysis and development of the rationale. The presentation step is client-facing, involves explaining to the client the recommendation and the basis. There are many times where a CFP professional who developed the recommendation is not the one who's presenting it, and we recognize that's become more common, which is one of the reasons why this is now broken out into its own separate step in the process. Steps 6 and step 7, these are very significant. In many ways, these present the most significant changes to the existing standard. The implementation standard is much more detailed. It's more detailed because of how important it is. This is where decisions are being made. You've developed a plan. Now you're deciding who's going to do it, how they're going to do it, and everybody has to be on the same page for this. It happens where a client believes a CFP professional is doing something on the implementation side. The CFP professional has a different understanding. So the very first step in this is addressing these responsibilities, identify and analyze the actions, the products or services that are designed to implement the recommendation. You have to determine how it's going to do so and what are the advantages and disadvantages. So communicate with the client what the recommendation is and who's being responsible, and then you're working through with identifying what it is you're going to do, what are the advantages and disadvantages of your recommendation compared to alternatives. Once you arrive at an implementation recommendations, you make the recommendation, and you need to tell the client what is the basis for selecting what you selected, what is the timing and priority of the implementation, and what about conflicts, right? Sometimes conflicts emerge during the implementation stage. So this is a time where you need to discuss with the client any selection that deviates from the recommendations. What this is intended to do is to make the client aware of any decisions that may deviate from the CFP professional's advice. Step 7 on monitoring. This is a very big expansion of our practice standards, because under the current practice standards, all it really says is that the CFP professional has to define monitoring responsibilities. Doesn't talk much beyond that. So what we've done is we put together a requirement for monitoring progress and updating. For existing client relationships, as you know, monitoring and updating may occur over many years or even decades. So this standard, step 7, becomes the standard that applies for decades potentially. Now, of course, it's going back through the earlier steps to do it, but it's technically within the monitoring standard that all that work is being done. So what has to happen here? You have to address monitoring and updating responsibilities. So that includes communicating very specific information to the client concerning the scope of the respective responsibilities of the CFP professional and the client. You have to monitor the client's progress, obtain current qualitative and quantitative information, so you're getting new information, and then updating goals, recommendations, or implementation decisions. So the monitoring progress part requires the professional to analyze at appropriate intervals the progress towards achieving the client's goals. The CFP professional reviews with the client the results of that analysis. So again, 7 steps now. There used to be 6. And if you look at overall what we're doing here with respect to the practice standards, we have a new definition of financial planning, an important new definition. Hopefully you'll find it useful when you're providing the training. A revised standard for determining whether the practice standard applies. There's a new documentation required. It's a new standard that provides flexibility in deciding when documentation is required. There's also more comprehensive requirements for the way in which a CFP professional provides financial planning in these updated steps in the process.
Wonderful. I do see one question, and Kurt, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and address it after the presentation is finished. But it is a question as to where the materials we're referring to, the vignettes in particular, and the PowerPoint presentation can be found. So we're going to hold that question until we're finished. Again, with this learning objective, we have 3 vignettes that have been pulled together for you to use, as well as several polling questions. So let's move on to learning objective number 4, recognizing situations when specific information must be provided to a client.
All right, so this is, people commonly refer to this as the disclosure standard. We call it providing information to a client because that's what a disclosure does. There are a number of elements here. There's 8 categories of information that must be provided, plus another requirement when the CFP professional is providing financial planning. There are timing and delivery requirements. There's also an updating obligation. These are the essential elements here, I guess, of this standard. With respect to timing, delivery, and updating, so you provide the information prior to or at the time of the engagement. This language mirrors the instructions for investment advisors when delivering the Form ADV Part 2 brochure. On the delivery side, again, all this, by the way, is in standard A10. So on the delivery side, the Code and Standards does not require the information to be provided to the client in writing when the CFP professional is only providing financial advice. But the CFP professional must document the fact that the information was provided to the client, so you need to keep your own record that's been done. You can do this by making a note in your CRM system. The Code and Standards does require CFP professionals providing financial planning to provide the information to the client in writing. So these elements that with financial advice don't need to be in writing. When it's financial planning, it's a whole new ballgame. It needs to be in writing. The one exception is conflicts of interest. That is never required to be provided in writing. However, the Code of Standards states that evidence of oral disclosure of a conflict will be given such weight as CFP Board in its judgment deems appropriate. So that's effectively a strong recommendation that when you're doing this, that you should provide it in writing, even though the standards don't require you to do it that way. The updating is an ongoing obligation to provide to the client any information that's a material change or update to the information required to be provided. So material changes and updates to public disciplinary history or bankruptcy information must be disclosed within 90 days, together with the location of the relevant web pages that publish that action in bankruptcy. And that's the updating standard that applies to this information. So what has to be provided? This is simply a list, description of the services and products, how the client pays, a description of the additional types of costs they may incur. The flip side of that is how is the CFP professional, the firm, and related parties compensated for providing the products and services. I mentioned this a second ago about relevant websites that have information about discipline or bankruptcy. So other material information, that's a principles-based standard. If it's something that's material information, the client has to get it. Full disclosure of all material conflicts, policies regarding the protection, handling, and sharing of NPPI, non-public personal information, and then information required under the engagement in response to reasonable client requests. These are things that must be provided to the client. So the terms of the engagement, this comes into play when providing financial planning. The terms of the engagement include the scope of the engagement and any limits, when the services are provided, and the client's responsibilities. One thing that's really important to note here, and you should remember this and note it to the participants during your session, is that a CFP professional is responsible for implementing, monitoring, and updating unless specifically excluded from the scope of the engagement. So a CFP professional providing financial planning, they're going to have to implement, monitor, and update unless the engagement explicitly has to directly address it, unless it explicitly says otherwise. That's a very important point that everybody needs to know as we move forward with the new standards. All right, so again, this one should be relatively straightforward because it's in standard A10. It's effectively a list. 8 types of information have to be provided with an additional requirement for financial planning, and when it's in financial planning, it has to be in writing. That's effectively what's captured in this learning objective.
for learning objective 4, we don't have any polling questions that we've developed, but if you think of some that you think would be relevant and worthwhile for us to provide, we would love to hear from you. On that, we've got a system set up for you to share information with us and for us to do a quick review before that information is actually presented. There is a vignette providing information to a client that is also available to you for this exercise. Learning objective 5, recognize and avoid or fully disclose and manage material conflicts of interest.
So as you know, conflicts of interest are really important. They relate most significantly to the duty of loyalty that you have to a client. Your interests are adverse to a client's interest in certain circumstances, and the question is, how do you deal with that? So at CFP Board, we've given a choice in the code and standards: either avoid the material conflicts of interest, so don't have them, get rid of them. That's a choice for you. CFP Board recognizes that there are conflicts that aren't going away. The fact you are compensated is one of those. We don't expect that CFP professionals are going to, provide their services free of charge. You're going to get paid for it, and you deserve to get paid for it. And this is a recognition of that sort of conflict as well as others. So where there are material conflicts that are not avoided, here's what has to be done. Provide full disclosure, obtain informed consent, and manage the conflict of interest in the client's best interest. So let's talk about each of these. The duty to fully disclose material conflicts of interest. So the standard, it says you have to disclose to the client all material conflicts of interest that could affect the professional relationship. So what's material? Well, it's going to depend on the facts and circumstances. The code and standards define both material and conflict of interest. A conflict of interest arises when a CFP professional's interests, including the interest of the CFP professional's firm, are adverse to the CFP professional's duties to a client, or when a CFP professional has duties to one client that may be adverse to another client. If a reasonable client or prospective client would not consider the conflict information to be important in making a decision, then the conflict of interest is not material. So full disclosure and informed consent. So the obligation requires the CFP professional to provide the client with sufficiently specific facts so that the client is able to understand the conflicts and the business practices that give rise to the conflicts and give informed consent to such conflicts or reject them. That's a lot of words there, but it's very important. I highly encourage you to read the notes to this section to fully understand what it is that's required here. One thing you should know is that if you're a CFP professional and there's a material conflict of interest, even if you believe you're acting in the client's best interest, that does not excuse you from failing to make full disclosure. You have to provide that disclosure to a client. And deciding whether to infer that a client has consented to the conflict, CFP Board is going to evaluate a couple things. It's going to look at whether a reasonable client receiving the disclosure would have understood the conflict and how it could affect the advice that the client was going to receive. So the greater the harm that the conflict presents, the more significant the business practice that gives rise to the conflict departs from commonly accepted practices, well, then the less likely it is that the CFP Board is going to infer informed consent unless there's clear evidence otherwise. Ambiguity in the disclosure, who's that going to benefit? Well, you guessed it. It's going to be interpreted in favor of the client. That language that's ambiguous is being put together by the CFP professional or their firm. So it's saying if it's ambiguous, it's going to be interpreted in favor of the client. Evidence of oral disclosure of a conflict, that's going to be given such weight as CFP Board in its judgment deems appropriate. Written consent is not required. Whether a client has provided informed consent depends on the facts and circumstances. It may be inferred when not explicit. So, for example, if you provide full disclosure and there's silence, that may constitute informed consent if the disclosure has sufficiently specific facts that are understandable to a reasonable client, but it may not constitute informed consent when that's not the case. Again, this is an important standard, one that bears reading in advance of the presentation so that you're on all fours with what it requires. Managing the conflicts, this is a very principles-based standard. You should expect guidance to come out on this, but the standard says that a CFP professional has to adopt and follow business practices that are reasonably designed to prevent material conflicts from compromising the CFP professional's ability to act in the client's best interest. So if you look at the flow chart, you have to manage the conflict, disclose, inform consent. I'm sorry, if you have a material conflict, you have to disclose, provide informed consent, and then manage. That's how that works in sequence. The obligation, by the way, to manage, what that means, and this is very important, is that mere disclosure of conflicts is not enough. You do not satisfy as a CFP professional your obligation if all you've done is disclose the conflict. You must also manage that conflict in the client's best interest. Again, a very important standard here in the Code and Standards. So we've covered the disclosure and management of conflicts. There are three basic requirements: disclose the conflicts, obtain the informed consent, and manage the conflicts. One thing before I turn it back over to Joanna about this is we are about to embark on a series of public forums. We're doing this both this year and next year, and as we go on the road, we're going to many cities throughout the country, more than 20. I encourage you to come forward, come to the meetings, come and say hello. I'd love to recognize you and the work you're doing in helping to educate CFP professionals on the standards. But these are important ways we're going to get feedback and information from CFP professionals on the standards. When you present your ethics CE content, it'd be very valuable to us to hear back from you. What are you hearing from CFP professionals? Because CFP Board not long ago formed what we call a Standards Resource Commission. The Standards Resource Commission is a group that will be preparing guidance for CFP professionals. We like to get feedback to find out what are the hot button issues out there where people believe they'd like to have guidance, so we can take that into account. The Commission will factor that in as it's determining the order and sequence of the guidance that they're providing. But it's valuable to hear from you. It'd be great to see you in person when we're conducting these forums. Joanna?
Absolutely. Well, again, as with the other learning objectives, we've pulled together some vignettes. You have 3 of them to choose from, as well as some polling questions. So this ends the formal part of the presentation as it relates to the content that you'll be delivering. Did any of you have a question specifically for Leo? I'm not seeing any questions. Leo, come up. So they must understand this absolutely perfectly.
Do you have the quiz ready, Joanna?
We've got the quiz ready. Yep, all of you, 20-question quiz. But essentially, there are some next steps to complete your instructor training. And that is, 1, to complete the instructor attestation if you've not already done so. And at that point, when we receive your attestation, we will do a background check. And once you have the all clear to move forward with presentation, you'll actually prepare your presentation and get it ready. The one thing that we will say is that tomorrow in the morning, you'll probably receive, actually you will receive an email from us, not only thanking you for participating in this webinar, but we'll also have a link to the attestation that needs to be completed, as well as a link to a program evaluation. Your feedback is extremely important, not only as it relates to this training, but also too when you start going on the road and making this presentation. We'll periodically send you emails just asking for some feedback. We'll provide real easy to complete feedback sheets for us. Again, our role here is to do whatever we can as it relates to the presentation of this content to ensure that we're meeting the needs of those that you're delivering it to. So again, complete that attestation at your earliest convenience. Once that attestation is completed and the background check is done, we'll notify both you and the CE sponsor that you're presenting on behalf of that the process has been complete. So the question about where do I find the materials being referred to goes back to the CE sponsor. Your CE sponsors have access to a link in the CE sponsor portal that takes them to a private web page. And on that web page are all the documents and support material that we refer to, including some of the information that Leo mentioned as it relates to the commentary from the first set of meetings that CFP board had before finalizing the presentations. So as always, we appreciate what you do for us. If you have any questions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to reach out. This concludes the Ethics CE Instructor Training Webinar. Thank you very much for your participation.